You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Part 1, Introduction. The beginning of the American Revolutionary War was marked by the Siege of Boston, which lasted from April 19, 1775 to March 17, 1776. During this time, American forces led by George Washington, who had just been appointed to lead the Continental Army, encircled the city of Boston, preventing the British Army stationed there from advancing overland. Both the American and British forces experienced shortages in supplies, manpower, and resources, with the British particularly limited to receiving provisions exclusively through their naval routes. These supply lines were consistently disrupted by American ships. The conflict commenced following the earliest confrontations at Lexington and Concord, when local militia from Massachusetts effectively cut off the land routes to Boston. The Continental Congress, convening in Philadelphia, transformed these militias into the Continental Army and named Washington as the head. Despite the British capturing Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill in June 1775, their victory was costly in terms of manpower, and they failed to break the American hold on the routes leading into Boston. The ensuing standoff involved no significant battles, with the fighting mostly confined to limited raids, minor clashes, and sniper engagements. The British struggled as their soldiers lacked adequate supplies, including food and fuel. In the later part of 1775, Washington tasked Henry Knox with retrieving captured heavy artillery from Fort Ticonderoga. Knox undertook the difficult journey and successfully transported the cannons to Boston by January 1776. This heavy weaponry was positioned at Dorchester Heights, from where it overlooked the harbor, threatening the British naval supply line. Recognizing the vulnerability of his position, British commander William Howe made the decision to evacuate his troops and equipment from Boston to Halifax, Nova Scotia, in mid-March. Part 2, Background. Prior to 1775, the American colonies faced a series of taxes and import charges levied by the British government. The colonists protested these measures because they had no say in the British Parliament. The British increased their military presence in Boston, deploying 4,000 soldiers under General Thomas Gage to control the increasingly rebellious Massachusetts Bay Province. As part of the crackdown, Gage was given authority to shut down the local government, which included leaders like John Hancock and Samuel Adams. However, the colonists defied these orders, establishing their own Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which discussed strategies, organized militias, and gathered military resources in preparation for potential conflict. Due to the Boston Tea Party and subsequent tensions, General Gage enacted the Boston Port Act, effectively closing Boston's harbor. This action led to widespread job loss and further unrest among the colonists. On April 19, 1775, conflict erupted when British troops ventured to Concord aiming to seize colonial arms. Militias from the surrounding areas confronted them, leading to the initial skirmishes at Lexington and then Concord, where British troops faced defeat at the North Bridge. As the British retreated back to Boston, colonial militias harried them, causing significant losses. News of the fighting spread, prompting militias from all over New England to mobilize and converge on Boston, ready to resist British control. Part 3, Order of Battle. In July of 1775, the structure of the British Army present in America was as follows. The Army was under the command of Major General Sir William Howe, who was the top military authority in America, holding the title of Commander-in-Chief. Overseeing the artillery and engineering units was Colonel Cleveland, the commanding officer of the 4th Battalion. Within the 4th Battalion of the Royal Artillery, there were several companies, the 1st, 2nd, 4th, 5th, and 8th. Additionally, there were 2 companies composed of less able service members known as invalids. The Army was organized into divisions and brigades with their respective leaders. The 1st Division was led by Major General Sir Henry Clinton and included the 17th Regiment of Light Dragoons, which was made up of 4 squadrons. The 1st Brigade within the 1st Division was commanded by Brigadier General Hugh Percy and included the 4th, 23rd, 44th, and 59th Regiments of Foot. The 3rd Brigade, led by Brigadier General Paget, comprised the 10th, 33rd, 47th Regiments of Foot, and the 1st Battalion of Royal Marines. Meanwhile, Brigadier General James Grant headed the 5th Brigade, which included the 22nd, 43rd, and 52nd Regiments of Foot. The 2nd Division was under the leadership of Major General John Burgoyne. Within this division, the 2nd Brigade was led by Brigadier General Jones and consisted of the 5th, 35th, 45th, and 53rd Regiments of Foot. Brigadier General James Robertson commanded the 4th Brigade, which included a combination of the 18th and 65th Regiments of Foot, the 40th Regiment of Foot, the 49th Regiment of Foot, and the 2nd Battalion of Royal Marines. As for the Royal Navy, several warships in the British North American Squadron were positioned in or around Boston. This included the HMS Boyne with 70 guns, HMS Somerset with 68 guns, HMS Asia with 64 guns, HMS Preston with 50 guns, HMS Mercury and HMS Glasgow, each with 20 guns, and the HMS Diana with 6 guns. Additionally, the HMS Lively with 20 guns was located in Marblehead, Massachusetts. On the other side, the Continental United Colonies Army in Massachusetts was commanded by General George Washington. Brigadier General Henry Knox was in charge of the Army's artillery. The Army was composed of various regiments, including the Continental Artillery Regiment, the Rhode Island Artillery Company, and multiple regiments primarily from Massachusetts, like Fry's, Nixon's, J. Brewer's, and others. It also included units from other colonies, such as the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd New Hampshire regiments, Varnum's, Hitchcock's, and Church's regiments from Rhode Island, and the 2nd and 3rd, along with portions of the 4th, 6th, and 8th Connecticut regiments. Part 4 Siege. Following the skirmishes on April 19th, the colonial militia in Massachusetts swiftly established a containment perimeter that encircled Boston from Chelsea around the Boston and Charlestown peninsulas to Roxbury. This positioned them on 3 sides of the city, effectively initiating a siege. Initially, William Heath took charge of the colonial forces, but by the evening of April 20th, General Artemus Ward had taken over command. The militia strategically cut off Boston from land access by blocking the narrow strips of land, Charlestown Neck and Boston Neck, connects the city, then largely a peninsula, to the mainland. The British retained control only over the harbor and sea routes. The number of colonial troops grew in the days following as additional militia units from New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut joined the siege. General Gage, the British commander, expressed his astonishment at the Patriots' organization and stamina, which he felt surpassed their past efforts against the French. To fortify his position, General Gage concentrated on preparing defensive posts. He ordered defensive lines to be set up in Roxbury armed with heavy artillery, and he had the fortification of 4 hills in Boston proper expedited, marking them as critical points of defense for the city. Over time, these strategic positions were further reinforced. Recognizing the deteriorating situation, General Gage also withdrew his forces from Charlestown after their retreat from Concord, leaving both Charlestown and strategic elevations like Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill, and the heights of Dorchester, which overlooked the city and harbor, unguarded. Initially, the British tightly controlled movement in and out of Boston, wary of weapons being smuggled in. However, an informal agreement was eventually reached with the besieging forces, allowing passage through the Boston Neck as long as no firearms were transported through it. Almost 2,000 muskets were surrendered by Boston residents, after which many of the Patriot inhabitants exited the city. Conversely, many loyalists from the surrounding areas sought refuge in Boston out of concern for their safety now that the Patriots controlled most of the countryside. Arriving in the city, some of these loyalists even joined regiments allied with the British forces. Despite the siege, the British were not completely isolated, as the Royal Navy kept the harbor open, allowing supplies to be brought in from Nova Scotia and other British-held territories under Vice Admiral Samuel Graves. The superior British fleet meant the colonial forces could not fully stop these supply shipments. Nevertheless, American privateers did manage to disrupt these efforts occasionally, leading to a spike in food prices and shortages that forced the British troops to ration supplies. The American forces were generally well informed about the conditions and activity within Boston through reports from escapees, but General Gage lacked effective intelligence on the Patriots' operations outside the city. Part 5. Early Skirmishes. On the 3rd of May, the governing body of colonial Massachusetts gave Benedict Arnold the go-ahead to raise a force with the objective of seizing Fort Ticonderoga, situated at the lower reaches of Lake Champlain in what is today New York. This fort was known for its large cache of heavy weaponry and its relatively weak defense. Arnold reached Castleton in modern-day Vermont on May 9th, linking up with Ethan Allen and a group from Connecticut who had separately conceived the plan to capture Ticonderoga. Under the combined leadership of Arnold and Allen, their forces successfully took control of Fort Ticonderoga and nearby Fort Crown Point. They also launched a successful raid on Fort St. John, securing the area's predominant military ship on Lake Champlain. In total, they seized over 180 cannons and a large quantity of weapons and supplies, which greatly assisted the Continental Army in their siege of Boston. Boston was in dire need of fresh meat and hay for horses, and to address this, on May 21st, British General Gage dispatched a team to Grape Island, just off the coast, to collect hay. The colonial forces on the mainland spotted them and mobilized the militia, which attacked the British team, managed to burn a barn, and destroyed 80 tons of hay, thus denying the British significant resources, as they were able to take only a small amount back. Continental troops were actively removing livestock and valuable supplies from the harbor islands to deprive the British of resources. On May 27th, the Royal Marines tried to thwart the Patriots' efforts during the Battle of Chelsea Creek, but met with resistance, and the British schooner Diana got stranded and was destroyed. In a move to quell the growing rebellion, Gage issued a proclamation on June 12th, offering clemency to all rebels who would disarm, with the notable exception of prominent leaders John Hancock and Samuel Adams. However, this attempt backfired, as it only fueled the resentment and determination among the colonists, prompting more to join the armed resistance against British control. Part 6. Breed's Hill. Throughout May, the British forces in the area were reinforced until their numbers reached approximately 6,000. On May 25th, 3 British generals, William Howe, John Burgoyne, and Henry Clinton, arrived aboard the HMS Cerberus, prompting leader Thomas Gage to formulate a plan to break free from the city's confines. The British aimed to secure the strategic high points of Bunker Hill and Dorchester Heights, planning to seize Dorchester Heights on June 18th. However, the Colonial Committee of Safety got wind of these plans on June 15th, leading them to direct General Ward to secure Bunker Hill and Charlestown Heights. Following these orders, Colonel William Prescott led 1,200 troops on the night of June 16th to build defenses on Bunker Hill and nearby Breed's Hill. On June 17th, British troops led by General Howe captured the Charlestown Peninsula in what became known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. Although the British accomplished their goal of taking the strategically valuable high ground, they did so at a steep cost, incurring casualties of around 1,000 soldiers, including 92 officers. The severity of these losses discouraged the British from launching any more frontal assaults on American positions thereafter. Although the Americans were ultimately defeated in the battle, they demonstrated their ability to effectively resist British troops, having repelled 2 major assaults on Breed's Hill during the fight. Part 7. Stalemate. George Washington reached Cambridge on July 2nd and immediately established his headquarters at Harvard College's Benjamin Wadsworth House. The next day, he took charge of the newly established Continental Army. By then, additional troops and supplies, including riflemen from Maryland and Virginia, had begun to arrive. Washington proceeded to transform various militias into a structured army, assigning officers instead of the militia's customary elections, and enforcing discipline and organization. To ensure clarity in command, Washington ordered officers to wear distinctive clothing based on their rank. On July 16th, he relocated his headquarters to Cambridge's John Vassall House, later renowned as the residence of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Towards the end of July, approximately 2,000 riflemen from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia reached Cambridge. Their sharpshooting skills, then new to the New England area, were employed to target the besieged British forces. Washington commanded the improvement of defenses by constructing trenches on Boston Neck, stretching toward Boston. These actions had minimal impact on the British hold on the area, with British forces occasionally firing on the workers and guards, and countering an American forward position on July 30th, during which they set fire to some Roxbury homes. After an American sniper was killed and disrespectfully displayed by the British, American riflemen responded with a day-long sharpshooting barrage that inflicted numerous casualties while sustaining only a single loss. On August 30th, the British unexpectedly moved out of Boston Neck, torched a tavern, and retreated back. That night, Americans attacked and destroyed a lighthouse on Lighthouse Island, overcame several British soldiers, and took 23 prisoners, only losing one American in the process. On another night, Washington directed 1,200 men to build trenches near Charlestown Neck, successfully completing the task under British bombardment. In early September, Washington began planning an invasion of Quebec with 1,000 men and considered an attack on Boston. Receiving intelligence that the British wouldn't attack from Boston before getting reinforcements, he sent troops under Benedict Arnold to Quebec on September 11th. He also proposed an amphibious assault on Boston across Back Bay, but was advised against it by his Council of War, who voted to postpone any immediate attack. During the same period, Washington authorized the adaptation of local fishing vessels for spying and disrupting British supply lines, setting the stage for the eventual creation of the Continental Navy. Connecticut and Rhode Island followed suit, equipping ships and granting privateer commissions. In November, British forces managed to confiscate 10 cattle in a raid at Lechmere's Point, but lost 2 men during a skirmish with colonial defenders. Later, on November 29th, Captain John Manley captured the British brigantine Nancy, a vessel filled with important military supplies for British troops. As the winter set in, the American Army faced gunpowder shortages, resulting in some soldiers being armed with spears. With enlistments due to expire and wages unpaid, morale was low. Howe, who replaced Gage in October as British commander, faced a lack of firewood, leading troops to demolish wooden structures, including the Old North Meeting House, for fuel. Scurvy, smallpox, hunger, and the threat of desertion plagued the British soldiers, while Washington also had to manage a smallpox outbreak among his rural soldiers, quarantining the infected due to stigma against inoculation. Washington considered an assault on Boston again in October, but his officers recommended waiting until the harbor froze. In February, when the water did freeze, his officers still advised against an assault due to a shortage of gunpowder. Washington reluctantly deferred his ambition for an ice assault in favor of fortifying Dorchester Heights with cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. In mid-January, British Major General Henry Clinton took a fleet to join forces in the Carolinas, aiming to capture a southern port, and in early February, British forces burnt farmhouses in Dorchester during a raid. Part 8. End of the siege. From November 1775 to February 1776, Colonel Henry Knox and his team of engineers undertook an arduous task to transport 60 tons of heavy weaponry, which had been seized at Fort Ticonderoga, across the iced-over Hudson and Connecticut rivers to Cambridge using sleds. The operation was complex and challenging, but they successfully completed it, arriving on January 24, 1776. Afterwards, the American forces utilized some of the large guns from Ticonderoga, previously unavailable to them, to fortify positions around Boston. They commenced a bombardment against the British on March 2, 1776, that went on through March 4th. Although the barrage inflicted minimal damage and some casualties among the British in Boston, it set the stage for strategic positioning on Dorchester Heights. On March 5th, George Washington secretly moved additional Ticonderoga cannons and troops to Dorchester Heights, where Rufus Putnam had devised a technique to quickly build fortifications using timber and bundled sticks, since the frozen ground was too solid for trench digging. This feat of engineering was achieved in such a short time, it astonished British General Howe. After an ineffective cannonade from the British, a plan to assault the heights to dislodge the Americans was called off due to a storm, leading the British to choose withdrawal instead. Despite a letter appealing to Washington for a peaceful British evacuation, which Washington formally rejected due to its informal address, the Americans refrained from attacking during the British departure. During the British evacuation, General Howe's attempt to co-opt supplies from Bostonians by offering them worthless certificates caused further unrest. Meanwhile, the American Navy captured several British supply ships. After days of unfavorable weather, on March 17th, the British finally set sail from Boston Harbor with a grand fleet carrying thousands of troops, their families, and loyalists. Part 9 Aftermath. After the British naval forces left, the American forces moved in to regain control of Boston and Charlestown. Initially, they suspected the British were still occupying Bunker Hill, but found that only decoys were left behind. To reduce the risk of smallpox spreading, Artemus Ward initially sent only soldiers who had already contracted the disease into Boston. On March 20th, 1776, once they deemed the threat of infection minimal, more colonial forces entered the city. While George Washington allowed the British to leave the city by land unimpeded, he made their escape by sea more difficult. He instructed Captain Manley to disrupt the British fleet, resulting in the capture of several vessels, including one carrying loot by Crean Brush. General Howe ordered a small number of ships to remain behind, with the task of intercepting any British ships arriving and directing them to Halifax. Some British troop ships that arrived in Boston unaware of the evacuation were captured by the Americans. With the British gone, military action in New England ceased. Washington, concerned about a potential attack on New York City, led his troops there on April 4th, beginning the New York and New Jersey campaign. 6 units of the Army National Guard can trace their origins back to the American units involved in the Boston siege, and there are 30 U.S. Army units with lineages extending to the colonial period. Sir Henry Clinton, who succeeded General Howe, suggested that Howe could have avoided the dishonorable retreat from Boston had he fortified the surrounding hills. Howe faced harsh criticism in Britain for his failures, but remained in command through 2 more campaigns. General Gage did not get another combat role following the events. General Burgoyne later participated in the Saratoga campaign, which ended in his capture along with 7,500 troops. General Clinton took over British forces in America for 4 years. Numerous Massachusetts loyalists departed with the British evacuation, with some rebuilding their lives in England, others returning to America post-war, and many settling in St. John, New Brunswick. After the siege, Boston was no longer a military objective, but remained an active center for the Revolution, its harbor vital for outfitting warships and privateer vessels. Its prominent citizens significantly contributed to the birth of the U.S. The region commemorates March 17th as Evacuation Day in memory of the British withdrawal.